Project Studio. My name's Eva Conrad and I'm a resident artist here. I'm here today to teach you the basics about working with clay and to give you a few rules we must follow to have a healthy and safe working environment. To start off, you may be wondering, what is clay exactly? Well, clay is a soft, loose, earthy material composed of very small particles. It forms over vast spans of time as a result of the weathering and erosion of rock, specifically granite, which makes up 75% of the Earth's crust. Granite decomposes feldspar, which contains alumina, silica, and flux. Clay can be hazardous when inhaled due to the extremely small size of particles of silica. This inhalation can cause silicosis, which is probably why cleanliness is the most important part about working with clay. Always make sure to wipe down your work area after working with wet clay. Don't wear your clay work clothes in other areas, such as your home. And then also, don't sweep up anything in the studio. This brings the clay particles up into the air where they will stay for a while. Anytime that you do sanding on your work, make sure you're wearing a respirator and do it outside or right next to a vent. So now, you should know, what is the difference between clay and ceramic? We'll often hear people use these terms interchangeably. The true difference, however, is the chemical structure change that happens in the kiln. So, to put things simply, clay is unfired and ceramic is fired clay. Before we get into the firing process, let's talk about a few tips and tricks that will make your work here more successful, as clay can be quite a finicky material. The best way to start out your work with clay is by wedging. Wedging makes clay more pliable plastic and ensures a more even consistency, as well as reduces air pockets. There are many methods to wedging, and it may take some practice to get down the muscle memory, so be patient with yourself. Once we have wedged and constructed our pot or sculpture through the process of hand building or throwing on the wheel, the next big thing to think about is drying. When clay dries, it shrinks. This is when cracking sometimes happens. The slower you dry things out, you can ensure a more even distribution of moisture. You can slow down the drying of your work by wrapping it up in plastic. There are different stages of drying we have different names for. Generally, we call all unfired work greenware. When a piece is stiff and retaining its form but still able to be impressed, we call that leather hard. When your work is completely dry and no longer cold to the touch, we call that bone dry. If you have any leftover studio clay that is either too wet or too dry to work with, we ask that you please place that in our reclaimed area located between the two main studio sinks. This clay will be reconstituted and made workable again. We must also pay close attention to the sinks that we use while cleaning any clay or glaze off of our bodies or tools or whatever else it may be. Clay can cause big issues in plumbing if it clogs up the lines. We do have two sinks that have clay traps on them, and these are the main two studio sinks, and you'll need to make sure you only use these sinks while working in your clay processes. We should go over a little bit about the firing process to get an understanding of why these last few wet work rules are so important. When clay objects go into their first firing, what we call the bisque firing, the main purpose of this is for all of the water to leave the clay. There's potential in this firing for your work to explode and damage others' work in the kiln. This is why it's extremely important for once your work comes out of this kiln, it's time to glaze. Glaze is a glass coating that we treat the surface of ceramics with. Glaze can be hazardous in a few different ways. Before firing, if ingested, absorbed through the skin, or inhaled in a dry form, fumes in the kiln can be hazardous, as well as post-firing, there's potential for certain glazes to leach out hazardous materials. Luckily, the kilns here have ventilation to protect us from glaze fumes, and our studio glazes have been tested for leaching. So the only concern we must have is the way that we interact with the wet glaze pre-firing. The best way to protect yourself from any hazardous materials that may be in the glaze is to wear rubber or latex gloves while glazing. Especially do this if you have any open cuts or wounds. Now to go into the glazing process. We use glazes that correlate with the temperature to which we're firing to. The way we measure firing temperatures is by cones. You can just think of this as an alternative unit of measurement. We are mostly firing mid-range here in this studio, which is cone 5 to 6, going up to about 2,232 degrees Fahrenheit. And our main studio glazes here will correlate with that. When you're glazing your work, you should first make sure you wipe it down with a damp sponge to make sure there's no dust on the surface. Next, you can paint wax on the bottom and about 1/4 of an inch up the side. Glaze cannot touch the shelf in the kiln, otherwise when it melts, your piece will fuse to the shelf. You can use a drill mixer for this, or a whisk, which can be found on the beam by the glaze table. Make sure you mix everything really well for about 1 to 2 minutes, including the buildup at the bottom of the bucket. This is extremely important to make sure, otherwise it could greatly affect the surface of your work. Use tongs or your gloved hand to dip your piece into the bucket of glaze. Hold for a few seconds, and if you choose to layer glazes, make sure you let the first dip dry before dipping again. When your pot goes into the glaze firing, something magical will happen. It will become vitrified, meaning the ceramic material has reached its optimum density and water can no longer enter through that surface. It is ready to be used and hopefully looks the way you hoped. And if it doesn't look the way that you hoped, I suggest you talk to the open studio monitor, your teacher, or the studio manager. Even if your glaze did not come out the way that you were hoping, this is really a great learning opportunity. Ceramics is full of mysteries. Well, that concludes the general knowledge on clay and ceramic work and safety. Looking forward to seeing you in the studio very soon.